Hello, everyone. My name is Kirsten Loita, and I'm the Senior Vice President of University Relations at Osage University Partners. We're excited our partner institutions are joining us today for a discussion with our investment team on startup financing trends and current market behaviors. We're almost halfway through 2018, and so we thought it would be a great opportunity to have a conversation on the current state of venture capital funding for startups, and to give our partner institutions' tech transfer offices the opportunity to ask questions in real time that they may have on particular industry sectors. You'll notice a poll appearing on your screen at this time. If you could fill this out, we'd love to know how many people are attending this webinar. We'll now go around our room so our panelists can introduce themselves. David?
Hi, I'm David Dorsey, and I'm a Senior Associate on the Tech Investment Team.
And I'm Manny Stockman. I'm a Senior Associate on the Tech Investment Team as well.
Hi, this is Anurag Agarwal. I am the associate on the life science team.
Matt Cohen. I am a principal on the life science investment team.
Hi, this is Stephanie Stamen. I'm a principal on the life science investment team.
Great, thank you, everyone. This is much of our investment team here at OUP. Our goal today on this webinar is to provide guidance to understand current market behaviors among startups and cover current areas of investment interest. This year, we will not only discuss general venture activity, but also investment trends specific to OUP's University Startup Network. We will not have a Q&A period, so we encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar. If you would like to submit a question, please use the Q&A feature on your toolbar. You should see either at the bottom or top of your screens right now. We really do like questions, so please send them our way. I'm going to turn now to David Dorsey, who will get us started with a slide on overall current venture investment activity in the market, followed by broad trends in tech, then a deep dive on our other panels in some of the areas such as software, hardware, therapeutics devices, and diagnostics. So, David?
Thanks. So for this first slide, just to make sure we're still on the same page here, this is overall venture investment trends. So this is not just university startups. And, you know, at the highest level, one thing to note here is that $84 billion was invested in 2017 in venture capital. And that is the most that's been invested since the dot-com era. And it also represents a 6% increase over the year prior. Now, this figure is a bit misleading, however, and the reason why is because it also is accompanied by a decrease in the overall number of deals. There's been a consolidation of VC dollars towards a few perceived winners. And this may be why, if at the universities you aren't seeing as much activity as this $84 billion figure would suggest, it could have to do with the fact that the number of deals has been declining since 2015, and the number of first financings has been declining steadily since 2014. And so one of the effects this has is that the median age of companies that are raising angel and seed rounds has grown 38% to 2.42 years. And what that means is, you know, your startups that are coming out of universities may have 2.5 years before they raise an angel or a seed round, which is quite a long time. Part of this is due to a rise in accelerators in the United States. There's a lot of really good accelerators that will help companies along with their go-to-market strategy and their business plan and get them to a much more mature stage where they're ready to raise a seed round. And so the number of first financings is continuing to fall, and you can expect to see startups waiting a longer period of time to raise that seed round. Next slide. And so this is our first slide where we're talking about specifically data that comes from our OUP database. And we accumulate it from talking to companies. We have our own internal data that we pull together. We also get it from a number of other sources like DataFox and PitchBook. And one of the things to note here is that the amount of capital raised by partner university startups has been steadily increasing each year, but just is the same as we showed in the previous slide for the overall market. The number of deals has been decreasing year over year for the past 5 quarters. So it's well in line with the overall trends here. We also list here the active VCs in the tech space, and this is not life sciences, this is only tech companies. So we have a list here of all of the VCs that are most active by the number of companies they've invested in. This data is taken from startups who have raised their most recent round since 2015. And again, these are only companies that are in our database from our partner universities.
And David, just really quickly so people know, we have 95 partner institutions, so this covers the 95 partners.
It covers all 95 partner institutions, right? That's correct. We'll go to the next slide. And so another way to break this down is also to kind of see where the startups are located. And you know, there has been a expansion of startups inside and outside of university startups from the Bay Area, New York City, Boston area. But I would say the data is showing that expansion into more entrepreneurial hubs outside of California actually seems to be happening more rapidly from our university startups. There are a large number of mature and well-funded companies in our deal logs. So if you look at this graph down here over on the bottom right, what this shows is, you know, a distributions of the dollars invested by the deal count. And, you know, the distribution is sort of split in half. It's a bimodal distribution here, where on the one hand, you have companies that have raised between, say, $1 and less than $10 million. And then we have another cohort here that have raised between 10 and, say, $100 million that have been around for a while in our system here. And so we'd like to see is in the coming years, we hope that this will accrue some exits and acquisitions within the university startup system here. Another way to break this down is software versus hardware. This top chart here has two axes. On the right-hand side, there's a software VC investment in dollars, and then on the left-hand side, we have hardware VC investment. So we have red and blue. You know, the reason why we break up these axes is because the amount of dollars invested in software is 3 times what it is in hardware. So we just want to make that clear here, but the trends are pretty clear. There's a year-over-year increase in hardware investing, and software since 2014 has maintained a relatively flat it's been relatively flat in terms of VC investment. There have been some sort of new storylines here. A lot more hardware companies are building a software stack or wrapping their hardware technology in some software in order to increase the value of what they're offering to customers, to more specifically target customers' needs, and also to get recurring revenue that SaaS companies enjoy. So there's been over the years a slight retraction from this kind of consumer mobile software, and that has paved the way for more deep core technology investing. In terms of the distribution here, in terms of the number, we have a chart here on the bottom right-hand side here, which shows by the year founded, the number of startups in hardware and software. The software is the blue, and the hardware is the red. So it looks like hardware investing since 2012, hardware startups have been relatively flat, growing really slowly. And then in software, actually, are seeing a slight decline in 2016 back to about 2015 levels. Okay, so on this slide here, we're doing is digging a little more detail into software sector. Some key observations you want to take away here. We have 2 charts. One of them is the VC dollars invested in software, and the other one is the VC deal count. And these yellow lines are, in the top graph, software is a percent total. And if you, you know, one interesting thing to see here is that the percent of the software's percentage as a total of US VC dollars really had a pretty sharp decline from 2016 to 2017, from 47% to 36.5%. And there really has been a downturn in both share of total US VC dollars and deal count in software. You know, a lot of this has been primarily impacting early stage financings, where the deal volume is nearly half its peak in 2014. Applications, SaaS, fintech companies have seen some of the most dramatic decrease in funding here. Some of the substantial investments are really going into a few select players, like we said before, where there's just a lot of money going toward a few perceived winners in this consolidation. But there, some of the emerging trends, specific places where we've seen a lot of activity and a lot of buzz is, first of all, around AI optimized computing. What we mean by that is that, we consider artificial intelligence to be sort of table stakes for many of these software companies that are doing machine learning, but they're now starting to see much more focus in a specific vertical. Some of it could be for optimized computing, in healthcare, in insurance, and so we see fewer and fewer AI platforms coming out and getting funding. There's also a lot more interest in things like serverless and function as a service, the ability to break software down into very discrete components that don't leave a residual state when they exit. And so that allows you to place the function in the cloud and call the function and charge per use economics, which is a nice innovative pricing model for software. We've also seen some next generation encryption. We've been looking at things like secure multi-party computation, homomorphic encryption, which allows you to compute on data while it's still encrypted. And we have started to see in the some enterprise uses of blockchain for things like data provenance and auditing data in databases. Right. So one thing we've hinted at earlier, we were talking about early stage deal flow, early stage deals kind of taking a hit. One thing we want to stress here is there's been a change in what is considered a seed round and what is considered a pre-seed. I mean, before a seed round would have been considered a 500K round, and now that's really considered a pre-seed. So pre-seed financing, what we used to call seed, has really dramatically decreased since 2015. And that chart on the left there, the bars are showing the amount of pre-seed capital invested per year in million. And the line there is showing the deal volume, the number of deals that are actually done. So in both deal volume and in the dollars that are being put into pre-seed investments are decreasing. Again, which is something that from the university standpoint is worth taking note of, because often it's that first financing that you're really looking for and that you pay most attention to. The other chart over here really is showing that the U.S. seed and angel deal flow in Q3 2017, going from 2016 Q3 to 2017 Q3 has remained relatively flat, but there has been from year over year a decrease in the number of deals that have been done at the U.S. At the seed and pre-seed level.
Thanks. Just a question there.
Sure.
For the pre-seed level, are there specific groups that are really concentrating on pre-seed? And can you comment on this?
Yeah, so I would say there are definitely some groups that, if you go back, we have, you can look back at that slide we had earlier that showed the VCs that are the top investors in tech startups. And some of these are accelerators, like, Y Combinator writes smaller size checks. And once some of these are closely aligned to a university, like Skydeck, it comes out of Berkeley. Accelerators, I'd say, are driving a lot of the pre-seed investment. I mean, if you're a software startup and you are looking for your pre-seed investment, I think a nice place to go is some of these startups, and there's ones that are tied to strategics and corporations, and there are others that are tied to university ecosystems. So it's a good place to look.
Right, thanks.
The last one here is just a way to kind of think about what is hot in this area and what is growing. And so one way of doing that is to kind of look at the increase, percent increase in keywords that are associated with VC-backed startup company descriptions. Like, one thing I want to point out here is actually, if you look at number 5, there's been a 1,000% increase since 2010 to 2016 in the use of the word university when you're talking about VC-backed startups. Healthcare is probably not so surprising, but neither is artificial intelligence. Things like genetic is really moving up the ranks up there, the 570% increase. I would say data science is definitely increasing here. I think one of the most surprising ones here is just the fact that in a company's description of itself, the word university is up 1,000% since 2010. That's pretty interesting.
So before we move on to our next speaker, I do have a question actually from one of our attendees about what is the average pre-seed investment these days? Do you know that?
You know, I'd have to look at the data exactly, but I would guess the average pre-seed investment is probably $250K.
Okay. But it's something that we can
look
look up
it
and get
and
back
probably
to
get
people
back
on.
with some real data. Yeah.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Great. So this is Manny Stockman from the tech team. Just a reminder to continue writing in questions, and we'll be happy to answer them as we go. So this slide is meant to be about physical sciences, not software. Some of you have software in a different bucket. In our office, we're still kind of creating a definition for where we want to put software in. But this is really meant to be the hardware world, the materials world, clean tech deals, and that space, which for the past several years, as David mentioned, has been growing, but it's still ultimately trumped by software. So software just has an immense amount of investment dollars going into it for very good reasons. But we're seeing a good uptick in the transition of two things. One, into hardware specifically, and then also just general core technology is going to be pretty exciting again. So specifically, I'll highlight a couple of areas that we've seen grow over the past several years. Autonomous driving is obviously something that's front and center in the news, and there's lots of hardware elements to this. And it's a classic example of where it gets really hard to define the lines between software and hardware, where you have LiDAR companies and computer vision companies using key elements of hardware to build strong software ecosystems around them and create either recurring revenue models or annual models off of an initial sale of a piece of hardware like a LiDAR. And the exciting part in this industry is, for the first time ever in the automotive world, you're seeing really significant incremental revenue just driven by the demand from OEMs to buy units before they actually commit to production. And so the space has been very active and frothy with a lot of investment at high valuations. And we just continue to be interested, looking for the right deal at the right price. In quantum computing, I think it's front and center for you all at the universities that this is one industry that's really nascent. No one knows what it's going to look like in a couple of years. But if there's one space that it's going to typically be coming out of, and it's the university space. And so we have seen venture investors continually ping us for exciting new quantum deals that we're hearing about. We've invested in two ourselves and continue to look at others. Beyond just the hardware, it's about how you start to build algorithms and software with a deep knowledge of the hardware as well. And so please, pay attention to your applied physics groups and see what they're up to, just because it's a pretty exciting space in general in venture right now, and we'd be happy to connect you to a lot of investors that are interested in making a bet. Robotics has just continued to be a very exciting space. There's what we hear of are a lot of bigger deals starting to close in the industrial robotics space, where factories are now starting to get on board with beyond just pilot deployments and really starting to drive in some real sales and high quantity orders for robotic arms and different grippers to fuel automation in their workforce. And so those are just a couple of the ones worth lightly touching on. I'll hit AI chips on the next page in a little more depth. But on the bottom left, I just wanted to quickly point out that there's been a strong growth, obviously, in hardware, and that's fueled by a few exciting consumer plays and a huge growth in semiconductor investments. And this is specific to the university space. The data that I'm showing here, this is compiled data of all the university startups that we track. And it's just important to note that that roughly $1 billion number is almost 10% of the hardware investment that goes on in overall venture activity. So it was really intriguing for me to see that the universities are responsible for so much, for a significant chunk at least, of the overall venture activity in the space. And on the right side, this is not specific to university startups. This is specific to kind of hardware and core tech investing in products like materials and clean tech and hardware. And on the top right, these are the most active investors in your space, or in that space. And I think it's really important when startups go out to raise money, if they're in any of these sectors, that they go after the investors that are active and specifically the partners that are doing it. And because not all startups are meant to hit those top tier venture firms right away, I also wanted to provide a grouping of the top small funds that will be doing pre-seed or seed size checks in hardware, just because those are the ones that can get a company quickly going and provide them the initial capital that they need to go after the big funds. So this is meant to be just a quick gloss over a specific sector that's probably one of the most active physical sciences sectors today. And I'm not going to call this a renaissance in semiconductor, but the chart on the bottom right shows something that's really shocking. If you were to look back, in the let's say 2005 timeframe, you would have seen this be continuing to steady around $500 million, and to see semiconductor startups pop up to $1.5 billion in the past couple of years is pretty exciting. And what's happening is this drive to build on all the technology that's been developed for machine learning and artificial intelligence software, which has seen a ton of investment and a ton of value delivered for enterprise customers, and start to think about how you can implement it more efficiently and more distributed. So both in the servers and data centers, the actual power consumption of driving these chips to do the algorithms is incredible. And so building dedicated chips that can more efficiently run through machine learning and neural network algorithms is really important on the training side for the cloud. And then that's creating companies that are going after basically Intel in that space, or let's say running alongside Intel, where you have chips that are meant to improve Intel's server algorithms, specifically in neural networks and deep learning. And then the other part of it is, how do you start to put some of these chips at the edge? Like, how do you put them in mobile phones, or potentially in, let's say, telecom towers, or in even our home routers and our home devices, so that you can do face recognition, speech recognition, without sending any data up to the cloud. And there's been a number of companies that have been fueled with, $50 million rounds in a space that in general has been really difficult to get the first, let's say, 5 or 10 million. Some of these startups are coming out of the university space and industry with a lot of early venture dollars. And the reason for that is because I think one reason is that you see a lot of the major corporations like Google and Apple putting money into their own chips. And that's been a sign that there's opportunity for this. So I'll just stop there. And is there a question?
Yeah, there is a question actually. So it's about an area that you didn't go into too much. So one of the questions around clean tech and energy that, definitely investment dollars have been declining, but there's still a lot of research funding coming in, et cetera. What opportunities in the clean tech and energy space still excite you?
Yeah, I think the areas that we've found interesting are not the classic ones. So, there's still a lot of energy, so a lot of resources put into research around solar and wind and spaces that are looking to kind of solve the technical or increase the technical efficiency of some of these products, but none of them are really solving the business problems of those industries. And so when we've been finding interesting clean tech deals and energy deals, it's companies that are, in that space, but they're not going after, they're going after the business in the space in a different way. They're finding unique ways to, almost solve lost energy, solve areas that are, it's almost like found resources. So they're solving heat rejection to space with other kinds of technologies like quantum dots, and integrating into HVAC systems, and new ways of creating water resources that can be deployed in very distributed ways instead of focusing on these huge, large deployments. So we really are looking for non-solar, non-wind clean tech deals is the best way to describe it, and really looking for something pretty ambitious at the same time.
Great, thanks. All right, we'll now move on to the life sciences sector, and Anurag is going to give us an overview.
Thank you, Kirsten. So we'll start off the life science section with the focus on therapeutics. And before going into the financing trends that Matt will take through later, wanted to give an idea of the different venture funds, and how do they play in the entire area of therapeutics development. So on the slide on the top, we have the different stages of development from very early preclinical, from company creation to early preclinical to IND enabling, and then to clinical studies. As you'll see in the first arrow in the orange, there are only a handful of venture funds like Third Rock and Flagship who are entirely focused on company creation, and they take technologies right from the universities or outside to form the team around it. However, the arrow just below that, which forms a bulk of the investors that we have put on this page, are the ones that play in either company formation or very early preclinical investments. So they play a role in both of those stages of the technologies, and combine these two buckets would be the most focus for the academic institutions that we work with, as most of the technologies are pretty nascent stage at this point. So there are a number of groups which are very active at that early stage of therapeutics development. Actually, if you go just below that, what we are also seeing is that most of the groups are moving earlier in their investment cycle. So some, like, in the middle arrow, where we have three investors, Deerfield, Frazier, and OrbiMed, who may have been traditionally be a much later stage investors, have started moving into much early stage. For example, Deerfield, who has also started doing some company formation efforts. And so as the market becomes more competitive for technologies, investors are moving in early stage, which is a great sign for our universities. That means more buyers for the early stage techs. If you go into the next arrow, this is a big set of investors which are actually not involved that much in the company formation, though some of them do dabble in that space, but they will do anything from early preclinical to actually IND or early clinical stage asset as well. So they spend quite a breadth of the therapeutics development, and generally come into the Series A or the Series B rounds for these companies. And finally, the below that is a set of investors that are actually still now focusing on much later stage assets, and something which is IND ready or IND ready in 12 months is more of their sweet spot at the earliest stage. And at the bottom, you see in the green arrow is a new class of investors, which have become much more active than than what we have seen previously. These are corporate venture arms. Either they have strategic ties with their pharmaceutical company or not. And they have actually they started coming in much early in the investment cycle, and are doing some of the company formation efforts as well. Some of them actively do more than the others, but everybody has started seeing some activity from them at very, very early stages. So overall, what you see here is in therapeutics, the early stage, there is a big pool of investors that focus on very early stage therapeutics, and therefore it would be relatively easy to find somebody who would be able to at least invest in the technology if they find it the right fit. And if you go to the next slide, this is to again have the point that as the market is getting very rich for investments, what we have seen is a lot of investors have raised a lot of capital in 2017 itself. And if you look, more than $1 billion have been raised by funds like Bioinnovation Capital, Pivotal, BioVentures, Vida, Arix, which actually have just come into the US for the first time, Quark Ventures out, I think, based out in North America. They are all investing in very early stage therapeutics companies, some at company formation and the others at very early preclinical stage. So again, pointing towards that, from a early therapeutics perspective, there's a lot of capital that have been recently deployed, a lot of people being active. And if you go to the next slide, what it will also show us that all the existing investors that we talked about in a couple of slides back, which were active in both company formation and early preclinical therapeutics investments, what we have seen is these funds, these venture funds, are actually raising their new funds much more rapidly than the others. And since all of these groups are very heavily active in company formation efforts, if you look every year from 2014 to 2016, On an average, $1.5 billion were raised by them, which are primarily deployed in early stage therapeutics companies. Again, a very rich environment for therapeutics, which is even further stressed in 2017, where we just saw $1 billion of new funds come up. The existing funds have raised $2.7 billion. And then that combined, if you think of more than around $4 billion for early stage therapeutics companies, would provide a lot of new technologies to be spun out with new venture investments. And so looking forward, there is a lot of capital that can be deployed in the therapeutic space, and which should be a very great sign for our universities. I think now I'll hand it over to Matt for the next section, unless there are any questions.
So thanks, Anurag, appreciate it. So I think it's safe to say that there's been quite a lot of capital raised to deploy into early stage therapeutics companies. Well, I'm going to now take you through some slides to try to address and understand what these VCs are doing with that capital. So the first slide here focuses on startups from our university, coming out of our university network. These are all private companies. This does not include IPO or any post-IPO transactions. And in the blue bars, what you're looking at is total capital invested in startups year over year. And in general, you see a trend, particularly as we had a robust therapeutics biotech IPO market, increasing dollars being raised by these companies privately. And you know, between 2015, 2016, 2017, roughly a stable amount of dollars being invested. One thing you do see though over this roughly 7-year period is that the number in the red line, the number of financings hasn't really changed all that much. So what that's really saying and reflecting is this trend towards these large mega round financings in biotechs, which instead of maybe previously you'd have a Series A round, a Series B round, and a Series C round, in essence, these companies are raising enough money to cover what they used to call A, B, C. Now they raise it all in the A and cover 3 rounds worth of capital at one time, frequently and almost always tranched based on hitting specific milestones. But overall, if you just look at the financings that were larger than $1 million, the median round size here was $14 million. So these startups are raising significant capital round over round. So moving on to the next slide. Taking similar to what David talked about earlier, on the right-hand side, this is really looking at geography, and it's not where the startups are licensing their technology from, but where the startups actually end up. And you see the 2 big hubs with red on them. That's Boston and San Francisco. But we are starting to see some companies setting up shop and existing in some of the other areas, like New York. Research Triangle Park in Durham, and a few other areas like Seattle, Houston, and even a small group of biotech companies making Ann Arbor their home as well as historically San Diego. Although I say San Diego fell off for a period of time, but is now trying to surge back again and catch up to some of the Boston and San Francisco numbers. But one question we always get, and I'm sure you are sometimes asking yourself, is what does it matter where the company is located? How does that affect, for example, how much capital they're able to raise? And so we took a look at this, and essentially, what we found was that, if you just look at how many companies were able to raise more than $10 million across all the geographies, it turns out, 42% of all therapeutics companies are able to raise more than $10 million. And that's important, right? Because therapeutics is a really expensive business, and you do need to raise a lot of money to get to an exit. But it turns out that it's, that company, all we did was look at, where was that company located. If you were in Boston, 74% of those therapeutics companies were able to raise more than $10 million, which really outstrips the national average by quite a bit. And really all the other these kind of key startup geographies like San Francisco, San Diego, RTB, they were all actually above that 42% national average. New York happened to be in line right around 42%. But all the other geographies, were below, kind of at or below that national average, really kind of saying that having your company in one of those hubs where a lot of the investors are located, where there's a lot of talented teams, can at least, if not directly responsible for, correlates with the ability to raise more money. So moving on to the next slide, we wanted to take a look at, which investors, which VCs are actually investing in university spin-out therapeutics companies, which could be and is quite different than, for example, in licensing a therapeutics asset from a pharma company. And so on the left, we kind of have the list of VCs here and how many investments they've made based on all of the startups we've ever put into our database. And you see some familiar names like Osage Venture Partners, OrbiMed, MPM, NEA. And on the right side, this is data that comes from the Silicon Valley Bank Healthcare Investment and Exit Report from this year. And you kind of see, interestingly, a different list. Alexandria Real Estate Investments is actually at the top. They're a strategic investment arm of Alexandria Real Estate Equities. And they write very small checks. But what you also see, which we found interesting, was a number of strategics. Novo, Celgene, AbbVie, Merck, KGaA, and a few others, Lilly there, which actually don't show up on the list on the left, which we found to be interesting and maybe indicative that the actual university investment is coming from one set of groups. And yes, the strategic pharma arms are very active in general investing in therapeutics, but maybe more active investing in, for example, startups that have licensed technology from their parent arms, or investing in sort of more developed assets that come from pharma as opposed to really nascent stuff from academia. That said, I'd say call out one exception, which is Novartis Venture Fund, which has been very, very active in the university startup ecosystem. On that list there with 21 companies invested in. On the next slide, we dive in here into what the early stage investment actually looked like and which therapeutic areas that investment's actually going into. So on the left side of that top graph is Series A investments. And what you can see there is that oncology it doubles, at least in terms of number of deals and dollars invested, the next closest indication. And next closest indication actually being platform companies, which most likely includes some oncology applications as well. But so oncology continues to be, at least over the last couple of years, heavily invested in. And you may have some of you may have read a recent research article by Jay Bradner where he argues perhaps we're far over invested in oncology. On the right side is looking at A and B rounds versus later stage rounds, which they define as C or later. And again, you see a lot of companies in the early stage. Again, the vast majority here is oncology, and so most likely, the interest in oncology is being driven by really some early exits, particularly in immuno-oncology, from some early stage investors. And so again, people, where they see the exits coming from, they want to go back to that well. So on the last slide here, covering therapeutics, talk about some of the emerging trends and some of the areas that we think are particularly interesting in therapeutics. And, one might say, well, we could look back on the last 2 years and say what's been really hot. We can try and project, what's going to be hot over the next few years, although that's sometimes challenging. And if I had that crystal ball, I'd be a very wealthy person. But we'll do our best. And the first thing you see on the top left here is immuno-oncology. And we've kind of ridden through the wave of the last few years of checkpoint inhibitors, but now we're coming into some new areas. So we have listed there, for example, tumor microenvironment modulators. So these are, in essence, modulating other cell types, not just T cells that one might find in the tumor microenvironment, like myeloid-derived suppressor cells and T regulatory cells. Additionally, hitting things like TGF-beta, which is immunosuppressive, is right now thought to be the next key target in IO. Additionally, cytokines have recently been surging A colleague at Atlas Venture, Michael Gladstone, wrote in a blog post at the beginning of the year that this would be the year of the cytokine. And given what we've seen with Nektar and Armo's recent deal with Lilly, that is certainly proving to be true. We're also seeing continued interest in cell therapies. The approval of Novartis' cell therapy, as well as Gilead's acquisition of Kite and then subsequent approval of their CAR T cell therapy has driven renewed interest amongst investors in continuing to invest in this space and really going after the next generation of technologies, which ultimately would allow us to address solid tumors, where today all of the approved products address blood tumors, blood cancers. In the second category there, immunology, autoimmune, NASH, it ties into immuno-oncology, but it's, again, thinking at how do we alter and regulate our own immune system to treat various diseases. Things like the inflammasome and modulating NLRP3 or other innate immune pathways continues to be of high interest. Immunometabolism, or ways of regulatory how our immune cells utilize energy to either slow them down or ramp them up. And fibrosis continues to be of interest. NASH is a very, very large market. It's quite crowded. There's a lot going on there. And I think one of the shifts that occurred recently was the FDA kind of changing how they look at the regulatory environment for NASH and saying, if you could either improve some of the metabolic issues of NASH or the fibrotic issues of NASH, as long as you don't harm the other one, we'll approve you. And that laying out that regulatory path has really helped investors understand how to develop a drug through that space. Novel targets and platforms, we're starting to see some really interesting ways of going about drugging targets. So, for example, if you have human genetic validation or you're a monogenic disease, that's continuing to be of interest for investors, particularly for orphan and rare diseases. But coming up with new ways to hit protein targets like allosteric inhibitors or drugging exocytes continues to be exciting for investors, as well as hitting targets with sort of no modalities. So, for example, we've seen a couple companies recently pop up, and Osage has even invested in a company in this space where we're looking to drug RNA targets with traditional small molecules. Gene therapy continues to be of high interest for investors. Recently, Spark had a Luxturna approved, and there continues to be a lot of interest in this space with regards to next generation technologies like viral vectors, novel ways to control the gene therapy payloads, and then just novel payloads, as many of the payloads that one would have wanted to deliver have been too large in terms of number of base pairs for the traditional vectors like AAV, but coming up with novel ways to shrink those payloads to fit into the size packaging that we have available to them. Going back to oncology, I would say I don't want to discount the rest of oncology. IO is certainly the hottest area, but I think as I talk to other investors out there, people are having some renewed interest in traditional oncology targets. So targeted therapies, ways of thinking about oncology again, based on biomarker selection. Things like synthetic lethality, where again, you have a built-in biomarker, is very exciting. And then novel ways to hit undruggable targets like KRAS, MYC, and beta-catenin continue to be very, very well-validated targets, but unable to be approached by traditional small molecule high-throughput screening. CNS certainly has made a resurgence, and a number of investors have made large bets in the CNS. Areas like pain, psychiatric diseases, and neurodegeneration continue to be of interest. However, I caution and say, this is not to say that you're going to, get a lot of investment for technologies or ideas that have been around for 15 or 20 years. This is not about coming up with sort of taking old, neuro anti-inflammatories and, putting them back into patients and hoping to get investment for that. I think this is about novel ways to think of CNS diseases, particularly when it comes to genetically defining these diseases, as well as defining them through circuits and neurocircuits through use of functional MRI imaging. And lastly, I'd say, orphan and rare diseases continues to be exciting. We've talked about genetically defined targets, but also ways of using gene editing in new ways, not just editing DNA, but also several companies thinking about how you can edit RNA, so a less permanent way of making changes, but would have similar impact on patients. And even today, a very large financing announced by Arch and F Prime based on work out of Harvard and the Broad called Beam Therapeutics continues to push the edge and boundaries of how we think about gene editing. So with that, I can pause and see if there are any questions.
We have a bunch of questions, actually. So one actually on the area that you were just talking about, we were looking for someone was asking quantitatively, how many therapeutics are you seeing kind of for rare diseases versus kind of your more mainstream therapeutics and drugs? Is there a way you can quantitatively look at that?
Yeah, so on the prior slide, orphan and rare disease, if you look at sort of that, new VC investments in biotech by indication 2017, there were about 20 investments in orphan rare diseases, which was the fourth most common category, $734 million invested in those companies. So, if you kind of add up everything here, you're talking about, 7-8 billion, so, roughly 700 out of 8 billion or so dollars invested. So, it's a reasonable amount. It's maybe 10% directionally of all therapeutics investing, but it's hard to quantify because, oncology has orphan diseases, platform technologies get applied to orphan diseases. In general, the idea behind taking an orphan disease strategy or a rare disease strategy is one, it's going to be much more favorable from a regulatory environment. And so, you really, you know what studies you need to run, you can identify the patients, and ultimately the idea is that you have a higher probability of achieving efficacy because the biology of the disease is more well understood given it's caused by perhaps a single genetic lesion. So, I'd say, based on this data, it's, Silicon Valley Bank's data at least, it says, maybe 10% or so, or 15% of the dollars are going into orphan rare diseases. But I argue it's actually much higher if you really took a careful look at what the other companies in oncology, et cetera, strategies really were going down.
Okay, terrific. I think earlier you said epitranscriptomics, right? Did I get that right?
Sure.
What is that?
Yeah. So what is epitranscriptomics? So I did skip over it, but I'm happy to talk about it. So everyone, and I'm sure a lot of people in the life science world or have biology backgrounds have heard of epigenetics, and so that's the concept that our DNA itself is altered or marked. That changes the ability of a gene to be turned on or turned off. So things like methylation, acetylation can control these things either at histones or directly on the DNA. Well, it turns out, and this is an area of emerging interest to investors, that RNA and mRNA itself is modified. Both, again, methylation is one of the key markers there. So both 5' and 3' ends of mRNA transcripts are methylated and have various other modifications. And there's also modifications that occur within even the coding regions of these RNA transcripts as well. And so just like epigenetics, there are readers, writers, and erasers, or enzymes involved in marking things and taking marks off. And that controls the ability of that mRNA to get made into protein. It controls its stability. It controls spatially where that mRNA might end up in the cell. And so basically there's been a couple companies recently started, some are still stealthy, but are raising significant capital from some well-known VCs to develop therapeutics that will drug the writers, readers, and erasers and globalistically and holistically change the way mRNA is being marked. And so for things like cancer, where it's believed that this marking goes awry, for example, cancer cells might maintain stemness or an undifferentiated state, if you could alter the epitranscriptomics of those mRNAs, change various stability levels, and drive those cells to differentiate, you may have more success, for example, treating those cells with chemotherapies, or in general, being able to cure those cancers, given the cells will be, again, a much more differentiated state.
Okay, great. Thanks for that definition. We have a couple other questions. I'm going to ask one of Stephanie. We have a question about given the repatriation of offshore U.S. dollars, have you seen an effect on M&A of non-IPO biotech startups?
Yeah, so we don't have this data in the slides today, but we have seen these numbers pulled together, and really there has not been much of an effect on M&A activity. I'll go back to 2015 and start giving some of the numbers from there. So there were 22 acquisitions in 2015, 20 in 2016, and only 14 in 2017. So 2017 was down a little bit. It's still within the bounds of what has been seen over the past 5-year cycle, but really no indication that there has been much of an uptick in M&A activity as driven by any repatriation.
Okay, thanks. And then one more question before we move on to the medical device and diagnostic slides. In general, when you're looking at opportunities in the therapeutic space, do you prefer a single therapeutic with a strong preclinical data or a platform technology with no in vivo data? And I know it's a tough question. The answer probably is around it depends, but please go ahead and your thoughts. And I have a follow-up to that. Platform versus single therapeutic.
I think it's a bit of an issue, sort of personal preference versus what's actually right or wrong. And I think the three of us on the life science team might actually even give different answers. I know, when I first started doing early diligence, I tend to gravitate toward single therapeutic plays where they have really strong preclinical data, but I'm pretty sure some of my colleagues might feel differently.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'd say I'm not too biased one way or the other. I mean, what I'd actually say would be, in general, if you're talking not just Osage, but VCs out there in general, some of them are definitely more biased one way than the other. For example, I think if you talk to the MPM capital people, it's very hard to bring them a single asset therapeutics company. They want to kind of build platforms. They want a multi-asset story. They've even started now portfolio companies that are designed to roll up assets into a single company. But there are other investors out there that are very comfortable with single asset plays like Avalon and Medici, who want to be as capital efficient as possible. So I think it comes down to capital deployment. If it's a single asset, you can be very efficient and just spend money on things that get that drug to proof of concept and then try to sell it. But if you're a platform, you need to spend a lot of money developing the platform, developing a pipeline, and ultimately your platform is valued based on how well the products you discover off that platform do. So it's a totally different mindset and play, and has different risk levels. I think at OUP we try to build a portfolio that's a mix of both, and we think from a risk diversification standpoint that's the right thing to do. But it's important to know your investor and who you're approaching and what their interests are.
Okay. Well, and the follow-up question on that particular question was, what is the seed or Series A financing percentage? Maybe more the amount that they're typically raising in seed and Series A financing. But
for a platform or
for either one, yeah, exactly. But isn't that something that was also sent out numbers on later?
Yeah, I mean, I think directionally platforms are going to raise a little bit more money. And I say a little bit, it could be a lot more money. You see 50, 60, 80, $100 million checks in Series A's for large platform ideas that could be, world changing. Single asset plays, you're going to try to be as capital efficient as possible. So the Series A's might be 10, 12, 15, 18 million. Maybe 22 or something like that, but just enough to get you through that initial clinical proof of concept. So in oncology, it may be through a phase 1B trial. For non-oncology, it might be through a phase 2 trial. But ultimately, the goal is still to get to that point in time and that kind of data so that you can transact. So regardless of how much money it takes, again, it's focusing on where does that investment dollars take you, far more important than, we're only going to raise 15 or only going to raise 20. If we need to raise 25 to get there, I think that's okay. We just need to know, are we raising enough to get us through that clear point in time where we could potentially sell it to pharma?
Great. All right, Stephanie, let's move on to med devices and what we're seeing in that area.
Right. So for medical devices, it's always a little bit hard to follow therapeutics because there's been so much robust activity and so much excitement there. I think medical devices over the past several years has really been holding pretty steady. The number of device deals in 2017 was roughly the same as what was seen in 2016. The one little bit of good news here, though, is that the total capital invested in the space did increase by almost 40%. So it was up at $5 billion in total device funding for 2017. This increase in funding was primarily driven by both an increase in Series A funding, as well as increased interest from corporate VCs who have been far more active in the space, and I'll touch a little bit on that in the next slide. The sectors where you're seeing the most activity, it's the usual cast of characters. I mean, there's really no surprises here. And cardiovascular captured the most investment dollars. That's pretty standard year over year, as well as neuro and ENT as being well-funded sectors. They typically see a good amount of development in those spaces. I want to comment a little bit on devices in the space, because as investors, anytime we're looking at a company and we're doing our diligence and thinking about making an investment, we always have to be thinking about the end game and how we're actually going to see a return on that investment. And so it's important just to consider just the overall state of exits for the sector. And so you'll see there really hasn't been much of a change in 2017 over 2016. Both years have been down off of the highs that we're seeing for both IPOs and M&A activity in 2014 and 2015. Hopefully that's something that will pick up a little bit in 2018. As far as the subsectors that's really driving those exits, it also is unsurprisingly a lot of activity in cardiovascular, vascular, surgical, ophthalmology, and orthopedics. So again, it's really the usual cast of characters there, so no surprises. I had mentioned that some of the increase in investment dollars being driven by corporates. So this slide here really breaks down a little bit who the more active device investors have been in the sector. So last year when we did this same webinar, I remember talking about really for the first time about how family offices and private equity funds had kind of stepped into the medical device space and were making up, at least in part, for the more traditional VCs pulling out of the space. And the family offices and private equity groups remain active in device investing, but we did start to see just a little bit of renewed interest from some of the more traditional VCs coming back into the space. So there was some increased activity from OrbiMed, for example, Novo, and HealthQuest. The strategic VCs are still really active, and they have been driving some of the increased dollars that went into the space in 2017. But it's important to note here that a lot of their investments have been focused more on later stage companies. So these have not been the sort of the pre-first-in-man data, early stage financing. It's definitely been much later stage investments. And then moving on to diagnostics and tools, this diagnostics, it really remains a challenging sector, although there are a few bright spots and a few trends that I think are worth pointing out. Funding actually, it increased 40% in 2017. There were $2.8 billion that went into the space, which sounds great at first, but actually that number was driven by these incredibly large investments in both Guardant and Grail. So between the two of them, that was $1.6 billion. So it was basically just two outliers that make it look as if the space or the subsector raised significantly more capital in recent years. So it's for the most part, it's been relatively steady for overall funding. What was interesting is that the number of Series A investments increased pretty significantly. It actually increased by more than 30%. Now, it's a little bit too early to try and draw any conclusions from that or to say it's a trend or anything, but it does show that there is at least some interest in more early stage diagnostic technologies. But the amount of funding in Series A deals has stayed relatively flat. So in 2016, it was only $500 million, but that's actually a nice increase from in 2015 when it was only $236 million. So a slight improvement there. within the diagnostics sector, the subsectors that are attracting the most investor interest, it's been R&D tools, and then diagnostic testing, and then finally diagnostic analytics. And as I had mentioned on the device slide, we always have to be thinking about our exit. And when we make an investment, what do we think our path to an exit is? And the challenge for investors in this space is really highlighted by the graph on the lower left, where you can see what the diagnostic exit landscape has looked like. And it's pretty abysmal. There was not a single acquisition in the diagnostic space in 2017. There was only one IPO. And so it just, it makes it very, very challenging as we look at financing for companies that are in the diagnostic sector to see a path to an exit for us. Now, it is possible. So usually when you think about who are your players that are going to acquire a company in the diagnostic space, it's going to be Roche or Illumina, the usual cast of characters. But there are increasing activity from some of the tech companies. So it's possible. I don't know if we'll see it this year or next year, but one might expect that as some of the larger tech companies become more active in the space, so we might see some acquisitions from the likes of Amazon, Apple, something like that. And then just kind of continuing on that thought on the last slide, looking at who some of the more active investors have been. For the past couple years now, the more traditional life science VCs have been staying away from the space. And this is now, we're going into almost 3 years where we've seen more of the traditionally tech-focused VCs who have emerged as really active investors in diagnostics. And that has actually helped with the space overall, because that activity is, at least not entirely, but at least in part, is making up for some of the decreased activity from the more traditional life science folks. And these investors on the tech side, I mean, these are certainly some pretty big names that I think everybody would recognize, Sequoia, Data Collective, Khosla. And the focus, though, and so these groups, I wouldn't say are investing just in diagnostics broadly. They are actually, seem to be far more interested in areas such as the next-gen sequencing, liquid biopsy, or really anywhere, any technology where you can take a tech advancement and apply it to something in the healthcare space. I think it'll be interesting to see if this tech investor interest continues over time. There are some pretty significant hurdles to the space. And these new investors may not be as familiar as the life science investors with the very long product development timelines. The regulatory and reimbursement paths are very challenging. And so I think it kind of remains to be seen how things play out in the sector. So if there aren't any questions, Kirsten, I'll turn it back over to you.
No, there are not any questions currently, but if you do have any questions, please follow up with our panelists. We are at the end of our webinar at this point, and before all of our attendees leave, we would really love to collect your feedback on the webinar. There should be a survey that's coming up now, but we will also be sending this to you in the follow-up email. So please let us know your feedback. We are very interested in knowing your feedback, and this helps us plan for future webinars. I think the survey is coming up in the chat box right now, so please look at the chat box for that. In the meantime, thank you all for attending. We really appreciate your joining us. We look forward to hearing your feedback and knowing what it is that you want to hear more from us about. Do follow up with our panelists. They do obviously know a lot about these spaces, and any questions you still have, they can definitely answer. Thank you for attending the webinar, and enjoy the rest of your day.